Thank you for joining us for this disinformation, misinformation, and fake news teach-out. My name is Benjamin Morse, and I'm with the Center for Academic Innovation at the University of Michigan, and one of the members that designed this teach-out. I will be moderating this connecting conversation today between Ben Nemo and Bret Schaefer, two of our teach-out experts. And the connecting conversations are really designed to incorporate both your insights and questions as learners into the experience and create a unique opportunity for our guest experts to engage with each other. So over the next 15 to 20 minutes, we're going to talk through some of the connections that you and our other learners have made between the various videos that Ben and Bret had created for this teach-out. So Ben and Bret, would you mind just reintroducing yourselves for our teach-out learners, starting with you, Ben?
Thank you. I'm Ben Nimmo. I'm the Director of Investigations at Graphica, which is a New York social media analytics company. And I specialize in studying large-scale fake and online disinformation activity.
And I'm Bret Schaefer. I'm the Media and Digital Disinformation Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is a think tank in DC. And I primarily look at state-backed information operations on social media.
Wonderful. Well, it's a pleasure to have both of you rejoin us for this conversation. So just to jump right into it, as we were going through the discussion forums and the teach-out, learners were commenting on how much Bret's information laundering scenario matched up with different sections of Ben's 4D model. So what do both of you think about that? Does information laundering align with one of the 4Ds? Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
I would say I look at them as being very different. I'll let Ben obviously cover the 4Ds since he created them. But, the information laundering is really about distribution, where the 4Ds are more about the messaging itself. So there's also another difference in that the 4Ds can happen kind of in the overt space or the covert space. But I think, many of the examples that Ben gave when he wrote that came from Russian embassies around the world and from RT and Sputnik. When you look at information laundering, that's usually something that's happening more in the covert space. So that's efforts to conceal a connection to a piece of information. So for example, when they hacked the Podesta emails and wanted to leak those online, they couldn't do that through RT and Sputnik because they didn't want their fingerprints on it. So they had to go through the process of getting that information into the information ecosystem and then moving it around. So eventually it was picked up by major Western media outlets. Obviously, state-backed outlets had a role in that, and they continue to kind of give a little oxygen to it. But, I look at the two things as being quite different, although, they obviously work in some ways in parallel. But I guess the main difference is one is about distribution and one is about the messaging itself.
Yeah, I'd completely agree with that. The reason I developed the 4Ds in the first place was as a predictive model. But the question I was trying to answer is, what are they going to say next? When I was developing the model, the they in question was the Russian state, because I developed it shortly after the annexation of Crimea. So one of the things which has come out with studies since then is how many different actors use the same kind of model and use the same kind of pattern. But the idea of the 4Ds is it's really answering the question, what is the threat actor going to try and say? Whereas with Bret's study on information laundering, it's much more about how are they going to try and get it in front of people without people realizing that this is actually a model from a hostile state. And there are various ways that can be done. And money laundering itself is a useful parallel to look at. I also love the idea of Smurfs. We have trolls and we have bots, but we don't yet have Smurfs in the disinformation space. So I think we need to develop the Smurf model of disinfo, because anything which makes it more lighthearted at this point is a good thing. But with the way the message spreads, you're looking at a different problem set, and it really is, as Bret said, from the point of view of the state actor. How do you get your messaging in front of somebody without them realizing that it's coming from you? So that's much more about obfuscation. It's about disguise. It's about using various different degrees of cutouts. Sometimes it's really clumsy. I mean, there was an Iranian operation called IUVM, the International Union for Virtual Media, which would basically take official Iranian government statements. It would take pronouncements from the Ayatollah's website. It would take stories from the official Iranian state media and then launder them through a series of websites. But the content was verbatim. What you were getting was more Iranian government messaging, just with the Iranian government label removed. It's really crude. What we've seen in particularly the more disruptive Russian operations, it's not so much about landing Russian information in front of you as disruptive or divisive information more generally. So there are degrees to which the distribution is covert, but ultimately the 4Ds are about what they're going to say. Information laundering is much more about how are they then going to try and land it in front of the audience.
Yeah, and thank you for both of those answers. I think that that provides a lot of context and a really strong foundation for folks to start making sense of this space and how information flows and how certain actors, actively and intentionally create these campaigns. One of the pieces that we saw come through in the discussion forums is learners relaying personal difficulties with helping friends, family, colleagues interpret misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. So thinking of kind of the individual and what their role is in this, what advice or thoughts do you have on how those people can encourage their personal circles to be more information literate?
That's one of the really tricky problem sets, because at that point you're not just dealing with information, you're dealing with emotion. You're dealing with individuals who might have a particular reason for wanting to believe something. And something we see a lot with disinformation campaigns is that they try and leverage people's emotions. They try and make people angry, or they try and make them afraid. Because when somebody's angry or afraid, they're much less able to analyze something rationally, and they're much easier to manipulate. And so when you're dealing with somebody who's already, if you like, ingested a piece of disinformation, is believing it's true, the first thing you really need to do, particularly if it's somebody close to you, is actually listen and ask them, well, why do you think that? Why do you believe that? Did this come to you in an unknown email chain, or was it a WhatsApp group? Did you find it on Facebook? How did this get to you? Why do you believe it? Why do you think it's true? And as you drill in, you might find that actually they want to believe that because it answers something else that they're worried about. And added to that, you have the human feature. None of us likes to be told we're wrong. None of us likes to be told that we've been fooled, particularly if it's fooled by a foreign information operation. And so if you just tell somebody, hey, you're an idiot, you fell for that one, you're probably not actually going to engage their sympathy. So you need to find a way of getting them to understand what's happened without making them feel like they've been a fool. As soon as you tell somebody you're an idiot or you've just got it wrong, you need to be able to soften the blow somehow. Again, particularly if it's somebody who's close to you. Because otherwise what you'll do is they will hunker down. They will think, actually, no, I'm going to prove that I'm right. And they'll become their own amplifier of the disinformation. And so much of what you have to do is actually start by listening. Rather than saying straight out, that's a full story that came from the Russian troll farm. Start by asking, how did you get there? Where did you find that? How did it come to you? Why do you think it's true? When all this evidence over here says it's not, why do you believe it? What's happening? And it's slow and it's painstaking. We've not yet found a way to reproduce it at scale, which is a big challenge. But the question is, how do you engage with the human being who is trying to digest that piece of information, not just engaging with the information itself?
Yeah, I mean, what Ben was outlining is the backfire effect. If you tell someone they're wrong, particularly in a way that causes them to become defensive, you often will harden their beliefs. So I think the advantage you have is someone particularly someone who presumably trusts you. You can have that conversation, offline, or at least in a sort of private chat in a way that doesn't have to publicly embarrass them. So if you're going to have that conversation, I'd recommend not doing it in sort of a public feed where this is going to play out in a sort of tit for tat kind of way. Ping them offline and say, hey, I saw you post this. Just, FYI, I came across this piece of information questioning that. I mean, it's all about the context and understanding who the person is. And, if it is someone who generally you don't think is prone to believing in sort of conspiracy theories, but seems to be promoting one, and if by presenting the facts you think that would be effective and kind of changing their mind, then that would be an approach. But Ben is right that, like, the first step is always listening. I mean, that when we talk about public diplomacy, that's always sort of the top of the chart, is listening and kind of understanding where people are coming from. And then the other thing you need to be cautious of is, sort of another thing, is the Streisand effect. So if you are kind of calling more attention to something, getting into a public fight and public debate, on your kind of Facebook feed, more people from your community are going to start paying attention to this, rumor or piece of misinformation or disinformation. So I guess the number one kind of strategy I would take it offline, or at least take it into a private chat where it doesn't play out in any kind of public forum, because it's unhelpful in many different ways.
That's incredibly helpful. I think that we can all listen a little bit more these days, and I think take a moment to step back and recognize our own backgrounds, our own personal biases that we bring into any of those situations. So that's incredibly helpful. Zooming out to a much higher level in this topic, there's been a great deal of discussion within the Connecting Conversations forum specifically about the spread of disinformation, specifically about how it can take on a life of its own and how it moves across these different platforms that we see, and how we even see it getting picked up in legislative events and like actually turning into law in some instances. So how do you think we can avoid allowing these pieces of information to take on lives of their own as they disseminate throughout our communities?
Well, Ben's work at Graphica, he'd probably be best positioned to answer this at the sort of network level. But I would say that the strategy of people running disinformation campaigns is to get that piece of disinformation to take on a life of its own. So it's very much kind of built in to what they're trying to do, is to get real people to pick it up and run with it, because, that's where people start really kind of believing in a conspiracy, is when their friends and their neighbors start talking about it. If a bunch of Russian trolls and bots were just talking to each other in a closed kind of ecosystem, it wouldn't matter. So there is an intentional effort to try to reach people, particularly influencers, so members of the media, celebrities, politicians, because once you get one of those genuine domestic voices to kind of pick up and run with that narrative, the work of the original kind of disinformation agent, for lack of a better term, is done. Because now the wildfire has started spreading, and the information ecosystem will just do the work for them.
That's right. And really the first rule is don't be a spreader yourself. There's never a good reason for publicly sharing a piece of disinformation. Even if you found it and you thought, hey, look, this one is really wacky. Everybody have a look at this one because it's really funny. Don't share it, because somebody somewhere is going to fall for it. And something we've seen with many different operations from many different actors is that they will try and land it in front of journalists or celebrities or politicians or amplifiers who will then do the work for them. We know that the Russian troll farm in 2016 was particularly good at getting itself picked up by the mainstream press, for example. We know that in 2019, Operation Secondary Infection tried really hard to land a bunch of US-UK trade leaks in front of opposition politicians in the UK just before the election, because that was where they were wanting to get the amplification done. So the first rule is really don't be a spreader. If you see a piece that you think is a fake, don't just start shouting it from the rooftops. Think hard about how you might engage with this. And then that comes back to the engagement point. Do you then contact the source offline if you know who they are? If it's something that you're seeing publicly, it's more difficult. You might want to think of, if there's a debunk out there already, attach that to the conversation. You run the risk of the blowback effect the backfire effect from the person whom you're debunking. But if you're attaching that into the conversation itself, at least you're getting it marked as, here is something where there is another point of view. But it's really about, the first step is watch out for being targeted yourself. And it particularly applies to journalists, celebrities, politicians. They are high-value amplifiers that information operations, we know, directly target. We've seen too many cases of this where an operation will mention a politician on Twitter, or they'll email them, or they'll try and reach out to a celebrity to try and get celebrity endorsement. And there's a reason celebrity endorsement is a thing. But if you think as a celebrity, if you're endorsing what turns out to be a piece of disinformation, you've spread it far further through the ecosystem. So the first step is really don't be a spreader. And then when you're beyond that step, again, think about how you can engage with the people who are spreading it in a way which is not going to explode in your face. Try and find a way to insert a more accurate portrayal of events into the story.
That's really helpful. So, kind of a follow up, thinking about the evolution that we're kind of experiencing right now. So we're less than 50 days away from the U.S. presidential election, among other major elections here in the U.S. How have we seen tactics change, and how have we seen the role of, say, social media platforms, for example, change as we lead up to this election?
What we've seen is, particularly if you compare it with 2016, there's been a fairly fundamental change in the environment that we're operating in. I mean, I think Bret will share my pained feelings of 2016 when there were a few of us out there who were raising the alarm of what was going on, and there just didn't seem to be awareness that this was a thing. In 2020, we have much more awareness by the media, by the research community, by the platforms as to what's going on, or what the potential dangers are. And you've got much more attempt by all the different parts of the community to catch this stuff early and get it dealt with. And there was a very good example a couple of weeks back where the FBI tipped off various platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, that they had found hostile state activity on the platform. You then had all the different platforms reacted to it relatively quickly. By early September, you had the announcement of the takedowns. It was attributed to people who used to be associated with the Internet Research Agency in Russia. There was some very, very strong reporting, very thoughtful reporting by the mainstream media on here's how this operation worked. And you had a body of journalists who were actually willing to ask the questions like, so how is this different from the last takedown? What was the impact like? It wasn't a sense of the reporting where people were saying, oh my God, it's the Russians again. It was, okay, interesting. It's the Russians again. What's happening this time? How is it different? So you've got a much more experienced and, if you like, educated body of reporters. There's much more research going into this. The platforms have certainly doubled down on trying to find this kind of thing. Law enforcement has doubled down on this kind of thing. So if you like, the defensive game is much stronger than it was. And what we've seen is that the operations, they haven't given up, they haven't gone away. But they're having to find the gaps that they can work through. So just as an example, back in 2016, the most effective of the Russian troll farms Twitter accounts, Tennessee GOP, was registered to a Russian mobile phone number, but it claimed to be the Twitter account of the Republican Party in Tennessee. And somehow it survived well into 2017. You look back on it and just think, how did that happen? It happened back then. I think it's fair to say that a signal like that this year would be a pretty big red flag right away. So what we've seen is that the operations are trying harder. They're creating smaller groups of personas that they're trying to make a bit more believable. They're creating the same persona on multiple platforms. So in the latest takedown, they were running fake personas which claimed to be journalists, but they had their bios on a website. They had their own Facebook accounts. They had their own Twitter accounts. They were on LinkedIn. They were trying to create these more believable, coherent personalities. But the challenge for an information operation is twofold. One, if you're doing that, you're putting a lot of investment into each asset, which means you don't have the time to create so many assets. And two is that if you send up one false signal, actually when you get caught, you've lost a lot of value. If you spent months building up one persona and you lose it, it's not just a question of creating one fake account and starting again. You've got to start back at the beginning and start building that account again. So what we've seen is let's say the more sophisticated operations are putting in more and more obfuscation levels. But what that means is that they're going to grow more slowly. They have to work harder to get the same amount of impact. And the critical thing is we're now less than 2 months out from the election. If they've just been taken down, they're going to really struggle to build up a significant operation in the next 6 weeks and get it back up to scale. And really that's one of the key things. If you think about the difference between the IRA in 2016 and the latest IRA takedown now, the 2016 IRA was taken down the September after the election. The latest bunch were taken down the September before the election. And that makes a really important difference as to what they can achieve around the election itself.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Ben that our defenses are certainly much, much better now. But I think the difference that Ben also kind of laid out is in 2016 and even through 2017, we were seeing this sort of carpet bombing approach, where now we're looking at really these sort of surgical strikes. And, my fear is some of the surgical strikes can still be quite impactful, particularly if you're talking about a hack and leak kind of operation. I think it's almost impossible that we'll see kind of recreation of the Tennessee GOP account, just because it wouldn't be able to stay up long enough to gain that amount of followers. And when we also talk about the massive amounts of accounts that were pretending to be Black activists, for example, I think it'd be very difficult to carry that out now. But for an account to come online and to at least start the fire of spreading something around hacked or leaked information, that can certainly still happen. And I get, if I'm also being a bit pessimistic, I think the place that we're in now, where it's different from 2016. 2016, we really were only concerned about the Russians, a few other players maybe. Now, the sort of threat landscape has exploded. So, just yesterday, I think there was news about some of the takedowns around a, Trump-connected kind of youth organization that was doing some of the stuff that's quite similar to sort of Russian troll farm kind of activity. So we're seeing both on the left and right of the political spectrum, but we're also seeing other nation states get involved. We're now seeing these sort of disinformation as a service companies pop up everywhere, both in the US, but also overseas, who will run these kind of operations for you if you have a little bit of money. So our defenses have definitely gotten way, way better. Obviously, the bad actors will sort of adapt what they're doing to try to work around that. But I guess the thing that makes me concerned this time around is that just there's a lot more disinformation players out there in the space. So it's just kind of harder to police the entire world.
And up top of that, the danger that Brett says about hack and leak, that's the one that's hardest to deal with, particularly if the documents are genuine and they're out there. Somebody is going to argue that there's a public interest in having these documents known. And particularly in a situation as polarized as the United States is right now, if you have a hack and leak operation which makes one party look bad, the temptation for the other party to jump on it and say, we don't care where it came from, it's important, is going to be huge. And so that's an open door for a hack and leak operation to jump into. And the problem is that that's not something that you can, you can't drop it on guys like Brett and me. You can't drop it on the platforms and just say, hey, prove that this is fake and make it go away. If they're real documents, then sure, we will do the research to say, how did they get online in the first place? Who spread them? What's the amplification pattern? Can we trace this back to a known operator? But ultimately, it goes far beyond that. You need to ask the mainstream media, how are you going to handle this? Are you just going to report what's in the leaks? Or are you actually going to try and report, where did they come from? Was this hacked? If it was hacked, was it hacked by a hostile state? There's a lot of broader conversation that needs to go on, which touches the media and it touches the campaigns as well. So that's a much harder one to manage. And in such a polarized environment, I think the threat actors know that you have a constituency there which are really going to have an interest in spreading the story for you. So coming back to the idea of a story taking on a life of its own, hack and leak is absolutely one of the big dangers in that front.
It also goes to a loophole in how the platforms are defending themselves against hack and leak operations. So both Twitter and Facebook have said, if stolen material is posted to their platform, they will take it down. But it's very limited. What that means essentially is if an account on Twitter is the first place where a bunch of hacked emails show up, they will take that down. But if a media organization reports on hacked material that first appears elsewhere, then it stays up. And I understand that, honestly, from a Facebook and Twitter perspective. I mean, if there is hacked material, public interest, and the New York Times covers it, we can't expect Facebook to start scrubbing the New York Times reporting on it. But of course, I think bad actors, as Ben alluded to, kind of understand this and will leak it to the party that is going to benefit from that information. And as soon as that party or parties who are genuine people or genuine news outlets report on it, post about it, then the platform's hands are kind of tied in terms of what they can do about it. So the hack and leak kind of operation is what I'm most concerned about, because I just don't see a great defense for it right now, because it's been mentioned again. It pulls in a lot of different elements and how the media reports on it, how it's covered more broadly. So it's just not a simple thing to deal with.
Thank you so much for that insight, both of you. My last question here is relatively open-ended. So, as everyone is continuing to go through this teach out, are there any other thoughts that you'd like to share, given the moment that we're all collectively living through?
I was going to let you take that first, Ben, so I have a chance to think about that.
So for me, the biggest thing is ultimately whatever comes up, keep calm and look at the evidence. So much of disinformation, so many information operations are designed to trigger people. They're designed to make people afraid. They're designed to make them angry. They want you to click on that button quickly and share it. And as soon as we're in that dynamic, when people start panicking, then there's so much disinfo that can slip through the net. And fundamentally, it's bad for you. If you're on your phone all day just clicking on panic stories, then at some point you're going to burn out. So it's really important for all of us to take a step back. And if a really sensational story comes in, particularly if it's got a really frightening or really, really dramatic headline, the first question is, who's trying to manipulate me with this headline? Why are they trying to manipulate me? What are they trying to get me to do? Is this actually real? If it's real, then yeah, it's dangerous and it's a problem. But actually, what's the proof? And getting people to break the emotional connection with what they're reading is really hard. And it goes well beyond just the digital disinformation space. But particularly in a time which is as polarized as this, where there are so many actors who have an interest in spreading really dangerous scare stories, not letting yourself get sucked into that vortex is hugely important. And so it's really important as a discipline. Sometimes just put the phone down and walk away from it, or close the laptop and walk away. You don't have to engage with the stories. Give yourself the space to think, okay, this sounds like a panic story. So why is somebody trying to panic me? Are they trying to sell me something? Are they trying to get me into trouble? Are they trying to put me in danger? Are they just trying to fool me? Or maybe it's a real story. But that means it being a real story is one of about 5 different options you have. So before anything else, keep calm, step away from the panic stories, step away from the stories that make you angry, and think about the actual evidence involved. What's the source for this story? Where's it coming from? What's the evidence they're adducing? Is it a single screenshot of a Facebook post without a link? If so, how do you know it wasn't photoshopped? How do you know where it's coming from? Is the piece of evidence somebody told me that somebody else told them that somebody else told them? Well, that's not a reliable chain of custody. So before anything else, particularly as November comes around, just keep calm and take the time to actually think things through before you read them and before you share them.
I would just add, kind of have realistic expectations for what you can do in the broader fight against false news or disinformation. I think, it's been in my job to look at this and to try to fight it, and I consistently feel overwhelmed with the limitations of my own work, because in the amount of time it takes me to try to get to attribution, if you can do it, which often you can't, but to even just to understand where the story is coming from, what the intention is, to do all the work in debunking something. There's 150 news stories that have popped up that are equally, if not more, problematic. So you just sort of constantly feel like you're, trying to plug a dam with your finger. But I think, if you're talking about the individual, what you can do is just be responsible in your own space, in your own community. When I have these conversations with activists, for example, I try to preach to them, like, you are not going to be able to fight every piece of false information that comes out. If we're talking in the election context, for example, that deals with the election, what you can do is make sure your family, your neighbors, whatever community groups you're involved in, that those people have accurate information. And you just kind of own your own space to a degree, and worry about kind of making a healthier information environment in your local community as opposed to the whole of the internet, because you will feel like you're constantly losing if that's your goal, to somehow clean up 4chan and 8chan. It's just an impossible sort of task. So I think kind of narrow the scope of what you can do, be realistic about it, but take ownership for your own space. And going back to a point Ben made earlier, like, ultimately, you are responsible for what you share and what you spread. And if you share a piece of false information, you become that source for your community. So, both work on making sure that people around you do better, but, primarily make sure you're doing better in what you're sharing, what you're spreading, how you're engaging with information online. Because if we all kind of practice better digital media literacy habits, these kind of campaigns would be less effective.
That's incredibly helpful advice, and I think a wonderful note to end this connecting conversation on. So Ben and Brett, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
And thank you to our learners for joining us in this connecting conversation. We look forward to continuing the discussion with you in the disinformation, misinformation, and fake news teach out from the University of Michigan.